Hello everyone, it's me Uncle John. Today I am going to read S4 4073 Spies of the Civil War by Carol Dombolsky. Chapter 1 An All American War. In this war, Americans spied on each other. During a war, getting information about the other side can make all the difference. If you know when and where the enemy is going to attack, you can prepare your army. If you know how many troops the enemy has, you'll know how many you need. Getting this information is the job of spies. From 1861 until 1865, America was at war. But this war was different. America was not fighting another country. Instead, two different parts of the United States, the North and the South, were at war with each other. It began in 1860 when Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Lincoln wanted to end slavery, but certain states did not. One by one, they seceded and left the United States. They announced that they were starting their own country. It was called the Confederate States of America. They even elected their own president, Jefferson Davis. President Lincoln was bitterly opposed to the South's election. He was determined to keep the United States together. That's why the group of states that stayed loyal to Lincoln was called the Union. In April of 1861, the Confederates went too far. They attacked a United States fort. Lincoln declared war. For 4 years, the war raged on. Most people believed that their side was right and they were willing to die for it. But then 500,000 soldiers were killed. The spies of the Civil War risked their lives as well. These men and women went fighting, but many spies who were caught were hanged. These were people willing to die for their beliefs. Chapter 2 Part 1 Union Spies. Elizabeth Van Loo, crazy for her cause, a Southerner helped the North. In Civil War days, most men wanted to be soldiers, not spies. They wanted to win honor on the battlefield. They did not want to sneak around looking for information. Also, most spies weren't paid. Soldiers were. Still, some men did spy. But many of the best spies were women. Most people thought spy work was too dangerous for women, so female spies were rarely suspected. And no one would have thought that a rich woman from the South would spy for the North. But they were wrong. Elizabeth Van Loo grew up in a wealthy family in Richmond, Virginia. But her parents sent the North to school in Pennsylvania. Going to school in the North, Elizabeth learned to hate slavery. The first thing she did when she returned home to Virginia was free the family's slaves. When war broke out, she wanted to do something to help the North. So she decided to become a spy. Elizabeth heard that there were Union prisoners being held in the jail in Richmond. She figured that they would have some information about what the Confederate troops were doing. She wanted to find out what the prisoners knew and tell President Lincoln. Back then, it was a woman's place to provide help and comfort. So Elizabeth took food and medicine to the prisoners. But Elizabeth's neighbors didn't like the idea one bit. The trouble was, Elizabeth was caring for enemy prisoners. Was she crazy? Heads up, Elizabeth went to school in the North. How did this affect the feelings about slavery? That's a question you have to answer. Crazy bad. Elizabeth figured being crazy was a great cover or disguise. So she began to act even crazier. She dressed strangely and she walked down the street talking to herself. Soon everyone was calling her Crazy Beth. Beth is a nickname for Elizabeth Beth. Elizabeth went to the prison day after day. She brought food and books. She asked about the prisoners' health and families. When the guards weren't listening, she would whisper, "What do you know?" And the prisoners would tell her. They told her where the Confederate troops were headed. They told her how fast the troops were moving. They told her where the troops hid their supplies. She also eavesdropped on the Confederates in charge of the prison and learned even more. But Beth did more than listen. She also helped Union prisoners escape. First, she hid them in a secret room in her house. Then she helped them get out of the city and head back to the north. Information on the run. At first, Elizabeth sent the news directly to President Lincoln in letters. But that quickly became too dangerous. The Richmond postmaster wondered why Crazy Beth was writing so often to the Union president. Elizabeth started using runners instead. Sometimes one runner would take the secret message from one point to the next, then pass it to a second runner like a relay race. Sometimes Elizabeth would tear one message into several pieces. Each runner would go a different way and carry just one part of the message. Once all the pieces arrived, the reader would have to put them together. Despite how careful Elizabeth was, people were getting suspicious of her. They started to watch her more and more closely. So Crazy Beth found new ways to keep her information secret. She sent her runners, dressed as servants, to the Union camps with the baskets of eggs. One of the eggs would be empty and have a message inside it. Elizabeth also wrote some messages in invisible ink. Someone had to brush milk on the message to read it. A spy ring. One person Elizabeth definitely wanted in her spy ring was Mary Bowser. Bowser had once been the Van Loo's slave. The family had freed her and sent her north to go to school. Elizabeth asked Mary to come back to Richmond as a spy. Mary said yes. Elizabeth got Mary a job as a servant in the home of Jefferson Davis. He was the president of the Confederacy. Mary never let anyone know that she could read or write. She never appeared to be listening or snooping, but that's exactly what she did. She listened in on battle planning and she read documents she found around the house. She passed on all the information to Elizabeth. By this time, Elizabeth was sending all of the information to General Julius Grant, the commander of the Union Army. At the end of the war, Grant visited Elizabeth in Richmond. He told her that the information she sent him during the war was by far the most valuable he had received. During the Civil War, everyone in Richmond thought Elizabeth was crazy. After the war, when the Jews came out, everyone hated her for helping the North. After all, Richmond had been the capital of the Confederacy. So Elizabeth died alone and poor. She had spent most of her money on the cause to end slavery, and no one from a town of Richmond came to her funeral. Chapter 3. Timothy Webster, the hero who was hanged. A good spy came to bad end. Timothy Webster had been a New York City police officer when he was asked to spy for the Union. He had already worked as a detective for the famous Pinkerton Detective Agency. His boss, Alan Pinkerton, would be working for the Union as well. President Abraham Lincoln had asked him to run the Secret Service. As head of the Secret Service, Pinkerton would be in charge of all the Union spies. Timothy had been one of Pinkerton's best detectives. Now he would become one of his best spies. President Lincoln would soon find out how good a spy Timothy could be. Lincoln was on a train headed for Washington, D.C. The train was to make a stop in Baltimore, a city in the state of Maryland. Confederate soldiers planned to assassinate Lincoln once the train reached Baltimore. Luckily, Timothy learned about this plan just in time. Lincoln's route was changed. The train did not go through Baltimore. Timothy's information had saved Lincoln's life. Timothy began spying because he wanted to help the Union win the war. But he was a northerner from a big city. People from the South would be suspicious of this New York Yankee. They wouldn't trust him. How could he learn their secret? The South's false friend. Timothy traveled deep into the South. There he made friends with Confederate soldiers. "Death to the Union," he would cry. "Let's finish up those Yanks." The Southerners believed him. One reason was that Timothy was a good actor. Another reason was that many people didn't support the side where they lived. Some Northerners supported the South, some Southerners supported the North. Timothy told people in the South a part of the truth. He told them that he had been asked to spy for the North. Then he had it a lie. He told them that what he really wanted to was help the South. Timothy was so believable that he was even made a corporal in the Southern Army. He was now a double agent. This was a very dangerous thing to do. If he got caught, he would be killed. But Timothy kept up his act so well. He was invited to join a Confederate secret society. He was even asked to speak at one of the meetings. The meeting was in Ohio, a northern state. The Confederates planned the meeting to try to get more Northerners to join their side. But Timothy had his own agenda for the Confederates meeting that night. He helped the Union soldiers plan a raid. As Timothy prepared to speak, Union soldiers surrounded the building. A signal was given and the soldiers stormed in. Many Southern leaders were captured. Timothy climbed out a window. No one ever guessed that he was working for the North. Instead, they congratulated him on his daring escape. West or East betrayed. Timothy might have gone on spying for the North for the rest of the war, but his own people betrayed him. Two Northern spies were caught on a mission in the South. The Confederate soldiers were pressed. The spies had hard for information. "Who else is spying for the North? Tell us and we'll spare your life." The two spies gave the name Timothy Webster. The Confederates could hardly believe it. Timothy had fooled them completely. Now the Confederates would get their revenge if Timothy was caught and given the death sentence. The Yankee spy would hang. Timothy stood on the platform. The hangman put the noose around his neck and pulled tight. Timothy took his last breath, or so he thought, but the knot on the noose came undone, and Timothy fell to the ground alive. The hangman helped Timothy back up the platform and tied the noose around his neck again. This time the knot held, and Timothy was killed. He said, last words were, "I suffered a double death." Chapter 4. The Dabneys. It all came out in the wash. A husband and wife team unfolded their secret. The Confederate Army refused to believe that African Americans were smart or be able to write. Like women, their abilities and talents were underestimated. That's why escaped slaves made the perfect Union spy. Very few written records of black spies in the Civil War have survived, but this one comes from a newspaper article printed in 1863. A Union officer wrote about it, and wife spy team. How does he know? During the war, a Southern slave named Dabney and his wife crossed the river to freedom. The river was in Virginia, and the northern bank was controlled by the Union. Dabney asked the Union Army for a job. The Union Army hired him as a cook and also as a servant to General Hooker. Little did they know that Dabney had a very different job in mind. Dabney knew a lot about the area. He knew all the land features and told the Union soldiers about them. They found this helpful, but were bepuzzled by Dabney. He was very interested in learning a Union code that was made up of a flag signal. These were unusual interests for the cook and servant. After weeks, Dabney's wife asked if she could go back across the river and be a personal servant to a Southern woman who was returning home. Again, the request may have seemed a bit strange. As the days went by, Dabney told the Union soldiers all kinds of information about what the Confederate Army was doing. He knew When the army was moving, the direction they were moving in, and the number of troops involved, the Union soldiers were amazed. They checked out every piece of information Dabney offered them. Every bit was true, but they couldn't figure out how he knew. They watched him, and he never went anywhere. Dabney was always at his job. How was he getting all this information? Dabney's come clean. It turned out that Dabney had a good view from a window at General Hooker's headquarters. It faced across the river, where his wife was working. Working for the Southern lady, Dabney's wife had a chance to learn that the Confederate Army was up to. What the Confederate Army was up to. Whenever she would find out new information, she would hang up laundry outside to dry, but she wouldn't hang it any old way. Japanese were using the flag signals to communicate. Dabney showed General Hooker the system he had made up based on the flag code. Pair of pants. Oh, wait a minute. A pair of pants hung upside down meant the army was moving west. If a white shirt was moved to the end of line, it meant General Ambrose was moving up there. A red shirt meant General Stonewall Jackson was involved. General Hooker was impressed, and for as long as the Union Army stayed on that riverbank, Dabney's had jobs as a spy. The South Confederacy, President, capital, state, supporters, Confederate. To go to form its own country, the Confederate States of America. Position on slavery in favor of it. Chapter 5. Belle Boyd. Flirting with disaster. No one hired Belle Boyd to be a spy. She was a volunteer. When the war started, the women in Belle's town watched the men go off to war. Later, some of these women became nurses. Others helped defend their own home. Belle was only 17 years old, but she wanted to do more. She was completely committed to the South and ready to prove it. Stop right there. Early in the war, the Union Army took over Belle's hometown. Belle's father was a Confederate soldier and he was fighting. So the Boyd women were left to defend their family home. When the Union Army took over, one of the first things they did was order everyone to take down the Confederate flags. When the Union Army took over, one of the first things they did was order everyone to take down the Confederate flags and raise a Union flag in its place. But the Boyd woman refused. Union soldiers went to the Boyd home to raise the Union flag. Mrs. Boyd tried to stop them. One of the Union soldiers pushed her aside. Belle grabbed a gun and shot him. The Union soldiers didn't fire back. They knew that in the South it was considered a terrible offense to push a lady. If they had shot back, they might have had a whole town of angry people to deal with. But also avoided person. But back then, young girls were not sent to jail. But the Union soldiers did put a guard at the Boyd home. The flooding for information. Belle wanted to help the Confederacy. She didn't know how to be a spy, but she did know how to use a beauty. That's how she got information. She began flirting with the Union men in her town. Neighbors were shocked. The Union was the enemy, but Belle was good at getting information. She found out about troop movements and secret meetings. She found out where weapons were hidden. Then she stole them. She even stole medical supplies. She gave the information and the supplies to the Confederate Army. Then one day, Belle found out about Union meeting. She sneaked inside the house where the meeting was taking place. Then she climbed up to the attic and listened over a small hole about the meeting room. She found out some very important information about the enemy. If she could only get that information into the right hands immediately, she knew that Confederate General Stonewall Jackson was leading troops not far from her home. Belle knew what she had to do. Bullet holes in her skirt. Belle jumped on her horse and galloped across enemy field. Bullets flew through the darkness. Some went right through her skirt, but made it to the Confederate side. She told the officer where the enemy had the fewest troops. She also told him where the next battle would be. This info helped Jackson win a battle at Front Royal, Virginia. After the battle, General Jackson, uh, I thank you for myself and for the army for the great service you have done your country today. Captured in time, the Union figured out what Belle was doing. They locked her up, but she didn't stay in prison for long. The Union released her in exchange for some Union soldiers. They wanted release from a Confederate jail. The minute she got out, she went right back to spying. Captured in time, the Union figured out what Belle was doing. They locked her up, but she didn't stay in prison for long. The Union released her in exchange for some Union soldiers they wanted released from a Confederate jail. The minute she got out, she went right back to spying. If Belle had been a man, she might have been executed. At the very least, she would have spent years in prison. But in the 1860s, men and women were treated differently. Also, even women spies, were not taken very seriously. And prison was a very serious place. The Union officers had warned Belle to stop spying. They had also told her she could never cross Union lines again. But Belle didn't listen, a hero in the South. Belle was treated like a hero. General Jackson made her an honorary captain in the army. A year later, Belle was put in prison again for going behind enemy line. As soon as she was released, she started spying again. Belle kept spying even when she got very sick with typhoid fever. Confederate doctors told her to stop spying, but she didn't. Belle was arrested once again. This time, the Union put her on a ship and sent her to England. When she tried to return to America, surprising thing happened. She was captured and fell in love with the Union officer who was in charge of bringing her back to America. The officer Samuel uh, Harding let Belle escape to Canada. He was kicked out of the Navy, but he and Belle met up again in England and were married. Finally, Belle's spying days were over. In England, she became an actress and wrote a book about her experiences. It was called Belle Boyd in Camp and Prison. Although Belle was arrested 6 or 7 times, she was put in prison twice and reported as a spy at least 30 times. But she was never hung. She died from another attack of typhoid. Chapter 6, Thomas Conrad, a shady character. Thomas Conrad would have done not anything to hurt the North. Thomas Conrad was a college professor living in the Union capital of Washington, D.C., but he loved the South, and living in Washington made it easy for him to gather all kinds of information. With this information, he could do a lot of good for the South and a lot of damage to the North. Secret operation. Thomas taught at Georgetown College. The dorm room windows at the college faced the Potomac River. Southern soldiers were camped just on the other side of the river. Thomas made up a code using the window shades. Thomas asked his students to raise and lower their shades to send information about the Union to the Confederate Army. The window shade code was discovered and Thomas was arrested, but he wasn't kept in prison for long. As soon as he got out, he switched jobs. He became a chaplain in the Confederate Army. A chaplain gives spiritual comfort to soldiers. As chaplain, Thomas was allowed to cross into the doors to visit certain prisoners. With a perfect cover for a spy, Thomas was a chaplain for several months. Then he decided he could do more back in Washington, D.C. Going back to Washington would be risky for Thomas. A lot of people already knew that he was a Southern supporter. So Thomas gave himself a new look. He dressed differently, he changed his hair and beard, he even learned how to chew his tobacco a different way than he went to work. But the Confederacy didn't support all he tried to do for them. Spying at the War Department, Thomas wanted to assassinate one of the Union generals. He chose General Winfield Scott. Thomas got a gun and made plans, but the Confederate government said no. Thomas followed orders. But he did not give up spying. Thomas went to the War Department. The Union War Department, that is. Some friends of the South were already working there. They let him into the building. Thomas would show up at lunchtime. That's when the War Department clerks left the desk to eat. But the clerks didn't bother to put their work away. All the plans and papers were just sitting on their desk. Thomas collected lots of information this way. At one point, he gave all the Union battle plan to the Confederates. It was the sum of the most successful spy work of the Civil War. The next move Thomas planned was a daring plot to kidnap President Lincoln. Again, the Confederate government said no. The last disguise after the war ended, Thomas decided to look for a job in the North. He disguised himself again. Unfortunately, his disguise made him look like a well-known criminal. So Thomas was arrested again and then let go again. Finally, he became the president of a college. That must have been pretty dull work compared to with his earlier jobs. Chapter 7. After the war, the spies faded away into history. In the end, the North won the Civil War. The Union took over Richmond, the South's capital city. Many Southerners cried that day. Elizabeth Van Loo cheered. She flew her Union flag. The Civil War was bloody and terrible. About 620 soldiers died. Many fathers, sons, and husbands were gone forever. Others carried the wounds for the rest of their lives. 5 days after the war ended, there was one more casualty. President Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at the Ford Theater in Washington, D.C. This was a great loss for a country that was trying to recover after the war. The South had been hit hard. Many homes and farms were destroyed. Entire cities were burned to the ground. A whole way of life was gone forever. During the war, Lincoln had declared that the slaves were free, but they still weren't treated as equal. Plenty of hard times were ahead. After the war, the spy tried to go back to having normal lives, but Belle Boyd became an actress in England. Thomas Conrad returned to working at college, but Elizabeth Van Buren ended up poor and all alone. Her neighbors never forgave her for being spy. Near the end of her life, she said, "No one will walk on the same street with me." The end.